Hello, viewers. Welcome back to the latest episode of the Free Marketeers vlog. Thank you once again for joining us. This week, I'm joined by Jacques, Jonker and Mpiyakhe Dhlamini. Thanks, guys, for being with me this week. I think where are we now? In the 30th week of lockdown. I can't keep track of how long this is going now. I think I'm slowly but surely losing my mind. Jacques, I'll check in with you first. How are things going? We had the announcement by the president yesterday evening. I think it is an extension of the lockdown. It is not the rolling back of the lockdown. It is an extension of the lockdown with certain provisions, but that's just my cynical take. But I'd like to get your take. Are you surviving otherwise?
Oh, yes, I'm surviving. I'm lucky enough to have an income. Most Africans aren't, and most middle-class South Africans appear blind to that. This is basically an extension of the lockdown. They did point out certain conditions that have to be met for the stages to go through the stages. But as Crystal Smith basically pointed out, this can also be seen as a job sharing schedule. If there's infections in your area, we shed less jobs. We'll ban less people from making a living. So no, I'm not that optimistic about this plan. From what I've seen, sure, it's one might say the scientific way to go about it, but I think people are really ignorant about the implications for civil liberties and the extensions of government's overreach. And we've already seen what the military is capable of when left unchecked. Military commanders, the police minister have already threatened illegal actions such as breaking down infrastructure, using the sale of alcohol, illegal sales of alcohol. We've already seen the military effectively stating that they are not accountable to Parliament when Section 198 of the Constitution explicitly says they are. And yet all of this is left unaddressed. I mean, the fact that the military, that this is the biggest deployment of the military in South African history, people just don't seem to care. Everybody is just like praising Cyril at this moment and just praising the lockdown and what they regard as the lifting of the lockdown. So at this point, I'm not very positive. Some people might call it pessimism. I prefer to call it realism. And so that's my take.
Yeah, I mean, we get load shedding in stages, and now we also seem to be getting our freedom back in stages. So it's interesting how these ways of thinking are applied. And Mpiyakhe, nice to chat with you again, of course, as always. What is your take on the announcement yesterday evening? How do you think things are going to shake out?
Well, I just want an objective criteria for ending the lockdown itself. It seems like we're just going from ignorance to ignorance. So there's no really proper justification given. I mean, just to give you one example, let's say for example, we understand the science of how this virus works, in how it affects the human body. Let's say we understand that perfectly.
Right.
Well, when you're talking about the understanding the spread of a virus, you're also talking about social factors coming in. So it also becomes a sort of a social science problem. And then if you're going to use the tools and methodologies of the social sciences currently employed, you're going to run into the pitfalls pointed out by the likes of, Mises in the Austrian school and so on, in how you make policy. And so that's sort of that's why government has to, it can't just be a matter of policy guided by scientists only. It has to be involved everyone, like economists, people who think about these things in terms of the potential unintended consequences and so on.
I think that point you bring on about data, I mean, we only have snapshots of what people are saying, on social media and that sort of thing, but it seems all around the world, there's definitely a move, especially in the US, I've seen people calling for at least data-driven approaches to any lockdown, which, I mean, is interesting because the lockdowns were just imposed unilaterally around the world. There wasn't any sort of data-driven approach. It was all fear-mongering and that sort of thing. So it's unfortunate that this has happened up to this point. I think for all of us, no matter your position on the seriousness of COVID-19, we all just want measurable, objective data according to which to measure the lockdowns. We all want to know when we can go back to normalcy. Jacques,
sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a final point, and that part of that is knowing when to use and when not to use data.
Yeah, That's a very important point, I think, not to be slaves to that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Jacques, you've written, quite a bit since the lockdown started on the economics of it all and unintended consequences. Is there anything you want to tap into what Mpiyakhe mentioned there?
Well, I'd like to tap into the fact that Cyril is basically borrowing the vast majority of the 500 billion rand from international finance institutions that are basically known as debt trap institutions. They trap developing economies in debt. And if the problem is already government debt, then why step into more debt at this point? And what frightens me is how many mainstream economists are also in favor of this. I mean, we are already paying interest on our special drawing rights at the FM if you want to do Fed swaps with the US Federal Reserve. All of this basically comes down to quantitative easing practices, printing money. And I mean, empirical evidence has shown that when you inject massive amounts of liquidity, you actually exacerbate the inequalities in society due to what is known as the Cantillon effect. So basically what that entails is the money gets injected at different points in the economy and spreads unevenly. Most prominently, it gets injected into asset markets that are dominated by the wealthy elites in society. And then at the end of the day, you end up with massive wealth inequalities. And when this money eventually reaches the lower income classes, real prices have already adjusted to basically render the nominal increases in people's incomes moot and redundant, essentially, because of the effects of inflation. So I'm not really that optimistic about the stimulus package that Cyril has. I mean, we have to recognize the fact that a lot of our economic woes is due to government and effectively to try and clean up their own mess by just incurring more debt. I mean, our debt was already forecasted to shoot over 70% of GDP. And the implications of incurring even more debt is even staggering. I've seen some figures, but I don't know how accurate they are, so I'm not going to cite them. But yeah, our debt to GDP is really going to shoot up. And oddly enough, I've seen some economists expecting that the SRB is still intervening in the secondary market for government bonds, because we see the yields not falling as they would fall eventually. So who knows, the SRB may be monetizing the debt even further. We just don't know at this point. And there's a lot of lack of transparency, especially from the government side. As Mpiyakhe pointed out, a lot of these regulations are arbitrary. They're not clear. They're not consonant with the rule of law as enshrined in the Constitution, the imperatives of the rule of law, as the FMF have pointed out numerous times. And just basically this is a resurgence in Ramaphoria, effectively we're seeing and it's effectively rendering people blind to the government dangers that we face here. I mean, a pandemic is never a nice thing. We don't want that, and it's not saying we're not worried about that. But that coupled with an overreaching government is even more dangerous, and the fact that something less dangerous, the virus, is causing people to be blind to something more dangerous, government overreach, really is worrying at this point.
I think two things there, especially, with government overreach, it's just been proven time and time again. The freer people are and the easier they can make their own decisions, the easier they can tackle these sorts of challenges. So we're seeing private laboratories, private investment, private pharmaceuticals researching vaccines. They're producing masks. Lots of companies and industrial conglomerates are trying to produce masks and other needed materials. So the focus should be on more freedom, allowing people to tackle problems better than they know how to, than any particular centralized bureaucracy. And then also the second point, we need to be very careful of the cult of personality. And this is not just to say it's just because it's the ANC in charge of government now. We would be worried if it was any party in government that people would sort of follow unquestioningly, like they seem to be at this point in time. It's worrying if you can't have debate and questioning about certain policies, in different platforms. For anything for a society or a democracy to truly be a democracy, it needs to have that sort of room where people can debate and question certain things. So I agree with you very much that it's worrying that we seem to be in this situation where we're so scared of something and so anti any substantive objective criticism that we just want to dismiss any criticism as legitimate.
Yeah, and what's worrying is this is really showing people are living in like bubbles of privilege. Sense that they praise Ramaphosa because they can actually afford to or they are capable of working from home, or if they can't work, they can to survive on their savings, or they have assets to sell, which in and of itself is terrible. The fact that people don't realize that the majority of the country can't. And then government induces the situation, and then they go and blame the people
Right.
who are desperate and simply trying not to starve to death and simply saying, well, this is what a first-rate president does. I think that's absolutely ridiculous.
Mpiyakhe, I think you wrote one piece, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago, about inflation and the sort of the danger thereof. You've touched on it before, how it's a different form of tyranny, I suppose we can call it that. Is there anything that you'd like to mention on that point?
Yeah, I think Jacques has sufficiently covered most of it. I just wanted to make a point regarding this, sort of allowing government to sort of take people's rights. This is a very dangerous thing to say, that the willingness, there is no vigilance at all, because there's a constitutional role for the public in holding the state to account. And if we just, when government proposes something, we just fall, we fall on our knees and we accept whatever they propose, then it's we are failing in our constitutional role to be critical, to be rational, to question things. And arguments that are put before us, to test them and to actually see if they make sense, there's any logic to them, there's any content.
I agree with you completely. We, maybe in 10, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, people will turn around and say, oh, how did South Africa become this sort of totalitarian state? And, a lot of people can point to the fact, well, people simply didn't question it. They went along with it. We don't want to imply at all that, tyranny is just something that can happen overnight. It happens in stages. It happens in different forms. It can happen through something like a pandemic. Then governments try and impose it in that way. And I think you're right to highlight the responsibility we have. We love talking about our constitution. We, at the FMF, we very much try and reinforce the importance of the rule of law, but it doesn't help if people don't take these concepts seriously.
Yeah, true. I mean, constitutions are more than just, words on a piece of paper.
Exactly.
It's actually also, a large part of it is about the culture that the citizenry hold among themselves. And the culture comes from each individual choosing to have like this standard on their own, like this standard of rationality, and questioning things, no matter what your ideological leaning is. Just just the basic sort of questioning, where government gives you a number and then the number doesn't turn out to be the actual number, and then but the policy is still the same, even though the observation has changed. And then you say, okay, but then surely by the scientific method you should be changing the policy as well, because the number has changed. This is true, because look at the model estimates they've been giving us in justifying the lockdown. It started out as between 12,000 people dead and 80,000 people dead, according to the initial leaks. And then that changed to between 100,000 and 160,000. And then eventually that changed to between 120,000 to 175,000. And then that now has changed to 45,000 people over 2 to 3 years. So, but the policy is still the same. So why, if we are making evidence-based policy, why is the policy not changing to reflect the changing numbers as reported by the government itself?
Mm-hmm. And of course, coming from the the puritanical, the pure classical liberal perspective, we want as small a state as possible. We recognize that, this is the real world. Not that I think, philosophy and the real world are two diametrically opposed things, but we understand that people say, okay, well, let's have policy suggestions. Let's have ideas that can actually be implemented. But what we're saying here is then have objective standards for those policies.
Yes,
we're not against
exactly.
sort of government, we understand this is the situation. Government sees it should have this role, but by what standard are they actually measuring what they're doing? That's our biggest concern.
I think we are in a fortunate position of having ideals that we can justify, like from, a set of first principles, and just construct coherent arguments from that to a specific policy measures. And also at the same time, we happen to be correct, or rather our assumptions seem to match what nature shows us.
Right.
And so because of that, we can also see like all the things that we call for reflected in the data. And I think this is what happens. Like, it's just, if your ideal is actually works with human beings, it should be reflected somewhere in the data.
Mm-hmm. Jacques, I saw you unmuted there quickly. Was there any particular point there you wanted to jump in on?
So basically, it's stunning, really, how quickly people simply forget all the policies, disastrous policy proposals that Cyril Ramaphosa is still in favor of. Expropriation without compensation, national health insurance, effectively nationalizing sport and recreation. I mean, trying to nationalize the Reserve Bank for nefarious purposes. You know, the problem with the Reserve Bank is not really the fact that the state owns it, because we're one of 6 or 7 in the world which aren't fully state-owned. The problem is the intentions, what they want to do with that, and that's basically to implement a low interest rate regime, which we simply cannot do at this point. It will screw over all the poor people in the country. Overall, he's still in favor of the National Democratic Revolution, which is a farce. He is still in favor of radical economic transformation, which is also a farce. And the fact that people have simply forgotten this and are simply just going along with the flow because of a virus there. And just to quickly touch on the virus's mortality rate.
Please do.
We need to consider the fact and not ostracize people who point out that the infection spread count, the number of people that have been infected, is probably grossly underestimated. Now, what this means is that implies that the mortality rate is grossly overestimated.
Right.
Because it's much easier to determine how many people have died from something because they undergo autopsies than determining how the virus is spread. A virus where a lot of people are asymptomatic and a lot of cases are so mild that people simply do not seek medical attention and do not get officially diagnosed. This is why mass testing is crucial. And so that you can have like Mpiyakhe said, a data-based approach that is actually accurate and that you can accurately estimate the mortality rate of the virus itself. But I mean, all these things and all the implications, the economic implications, the rule of law implications, simply gone out the window, or people hear it and goes in the one ear out through the other one, simply because, you know, it's Mr. President, we are led, etc., etc.
No, as long as we have our Wi-Fi and our widescreen TVs, we seem to be okay with the massive deployment of the army and people in townships being abused and beaten up
and murdered. And yeah, I mean, it's, as I said, it's living in your silly little bubble of privilege that you think, okay, we'll be okay because I will be okay, when the masses of people will not be okay. And just considering the fact that people have simply gone blind to not just the president's faults, but the whole ANC's faults and their entire ideology. I mean, this is boosting their capabilities of controlling society, and people are simply blind to that. And when this crisis is over eventually, these will be the first people, when the poor strikes the fan, who will flee to Australia, right, or live in their secure, comfy estates in Eastern Pretoria or whatever, simply because they cannot recognize the dangers that government poses, and that the dangers on civil liberties is much bigger than the dangers that any virus can pose to us.
Mpiyakhe, I'm going to put you in the president's chair, you know, because, you know, us white guys, we see all black people as exactly the same. So if I put you in Cyril's chair, I'll see you as exactly the same person. If you were there last night, what would you have sort of done in terms of a lockdown, do you think? I know that's a tough question, but going forward, what to you is a smart lockdown?
Well, a smart lockdown is one where government plays a role where it could be effective, which is assembling a team of experts, scientists, like it has done, to design with the explicit purpose to design voluntary recommendations for the private sector on what to do and to market these recommendations. That is all the government needs to do, and then trust in the rationality of individuals to take over. Because if we don't have that basic trust in society, then we might as well not even try. I mean, like, what's the point? If we accept the premise that certain people cannot be trusted to make rational decisions, then who can be trusted to make those decisions? And then it's an open question, because the decision still needs to be made. And so, for me, it makes sense to just trust people, and then let people do what they feel is right, and then that will turn out to be the right answer in the end. I promise. Like, the data might not show it today or a year from now, but eventually eventually reflect that it was the right decision, because ultimately people are rational.
And even more than that, I mean, that sort of freedom that I think that you highlight very importantly, it ensures that some people have a better chance to obtain food, to make some sort of living, something like that. There seems to be this false dichotomy between health and economic well-being, where for me, for a lot of people, my understanding is, and maybe I am coming from a position of ignorance, but I just see it as people are trying to make a living. It's already insanely difficult because of transport costs and that sort of thing for people to travel into the city centers. So now with the lockdown, it makes it even more difficult.
Yeah, and people just because you're poor doesn't mean that you're dumb. You make calculations, of course. You realize, okay, there's this threat. I mean, I remember with HIV and AIDS, there was a massive education campaign, and behavior started changing because of that. Because people realized, okay, this can harm me, and this is how it can harm me, and people change their behavior because of that. And so I think the same applies here. Just allow people to make those behavior changes when it is appropriate. When they can't, because the calculation, the trade-off would be much worse than the actual results of contracting COVID-19 according to their personal risk analysis, then you allow them to make a different decision. Like, I mean, there's no need for government to be violently involved like this. The only thing that acts as a compounding factor is the existence of the commons. The fact that there's so much shared public spaces that which no one really owns, which no one can make decisions about whether to shut, because we all own it supposedly. And so that would be the only thing. So the solution to that is simply to privatize them. But
there we have the anarchist perspective. Jacques, I wanted to give you a brain teaser. What do you think is going to happen first? Is SAA going to be liquidated, or is the lockdown going to end? Which one's going to happen first?
I think SAA will be liquidated long before the lockdown ends.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that.
It depends on how you define a lockdown ending, because I mean, is these stages that the government have proposed, basically, is stage one really an end to a lockdown? Is it like a pure end? It's not really a pure end to a lockdown. A very watered down version of a lockdown. Effectively, you can argue ending it, but it really ended. But yeah, I think SAA will be liquidated long before that.
We've been fighting for that for so long. I mean, it's nice to hear that it might happen, but no, please jump in, Mpiyakhe.
I wanted to comment on what Jacques was saying. I think it's a very important point about the criteria. Like, you don't want to have a perpetual lockdown, because this is a violation of our civil liberties. The longer it continues, the worse it gets. So you don't want a perpetual lockdown, because that's how you get an authoritarian state. And so the criteria is very important. So paying attention to the exact wording of the implementing regulations that will be released over the following days is very important, and analyzing it and breaking it down for people, so that we understand when it's supposed to end. When does the point come when we no longer need to apply the stages? What is the criteria for it? What is the objective criteria? What is the criteria that all of us can measure and have access to the numbers and know when the criteria has been met? And then the stages as well. Like, stage one, is it an end, or just a one part of a cycle? And so I think this idea of a smart lockdown was actually a very bad idea if it is implemented in a particular way, because it will just throw the rule of law out of the window.
I think even under stage one, some of the leaked documents I've seen, so again, I give that sort of that asterisk next to what I say, but even in stage one, there could still be restrictions on international travel. So do we consider stage one the best kind of thing compared to stage 5 or stage 4? When is stage 0? And it doesn't seem that anything like that has yet been offered. So it's up to us and to the citizens of the country to hold government accountable and to ask these sorts of questions.
Yeah, true. And just to also, engage with each other, debate, and not be too emotional. I think a lot of people are reacting with emotion instead of debating. And so I think that needs to stop as well. I mean, you can't let fear dominate you. That's how you lose. That's how you become a slave, if you let fear dominate you. The life of a free man is the life of someone who is brave, who thinks for themselves, who always puts logic first, because that's the only way to live, taking that responsibility for your life. No one is coming to save you.
And of course, for a lot of people, they are very scared of the virus and they're worried about what might happen to their families, especially elderly family members. But, even there, that fear, I mean, that should show you that those people are very important to you. You want the best sort of life for them. A perpetual lockdown will not be the best for anyone's life. So you need to think a bit more long term. Just interrogate some of the things that you might hear on radio, on TV, some of the things you read online. Just ask a few more questions. That's all.
Yeah, true. And, like people, just to develop this point, during the AIDS pandemic, people were dying like flies at some point, and there was really no government anywhere. Like, people were on their own. They had to figure it out for themselves and deal with it. And they did, like even the poorest communities in the country. And so I don't know where this faith in government comes from. I don't think it's a poor people thing. Like I know like the poor sort of vote in a different way in the way they act in the market, which is fascinating. But like it's very interesting because when you see that kind of thing, like it's sort of people can rely on themselves. They are able to make these decisions for themselves. We don't need to be interfering all the time in people's lives.
No, I think you're right there. And a phrase I've used, thrown around, which I like. I don't like these sorts of labels and these sort of Marxist ways of analysis, but I feel like a lockdown is a very bourgeois sort of tool, very bourgeois solution to maybe a bourgeois problem.
Yeah, and you can sort of make like these calculations for if you're in the middle class, because you can sort of you have some buffers, you have reserves, as Jacques said.
Yeah, you have wiggle room. Yeah. Jacques, anything for you there?
Yeah, just so if you're one of the people that recognized all the 80s failures, EWC, NHI, etc., yet now all of a sudden you praise the president who was leading the charges in most of these things, I think you're a fool. And if you are one of those people who are actually praising poor people who are trying to feed themselves, getting arrested, I saw a person wanting to report waste pickers on the street trying to survive. And I just think you're a downright immoral human being if you cannot recognize and just pop your little bubble of privilege and see that actually we are all living in very precarious times. There's disproportionately affecting poor people, and the fact that so many upper middle class and high income class people simply cannot recognize that. This is a sad indictment of people's general perceptions of civil liberties. Civil liberty for me, but not for thee, as they usually say. So I just really think people should do a lot of introspection on this.
It also might be, in a way, we can touch on some psychology and get your guys' take on it. Maybe I'm reaching here, but it's a very infantilizing view of people and their agency, at least of certain groups of people. Maybe you can call them race groups, income classes, that sort of thing. It's a view that without the government, people would just not know at all what to do. I guess they would just behave like idiots.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And I mean, like Trevor Ruddock said on Facebook, is what do poor people need? They need money. They do not need decisions made for them. So all infantilizing, paternalistic bigotry of low expectations, and in a lot of cases downright racism, is really, really disturbing at this point. And this general paradigm that people hate government when it suits them and love government when it suits them, and they're incapable of questioning the fundamental nature that is the institution that is government. The fact that they cannot question that, and the fact that they just take government and extensive government's involvement in society for granted, the fact that they just take their freedoms for granted, I think I won't say it angers me, it just leaves me in despair, basically, because where do you go from here? How do you convince people who are so obsessed with justifying state intervention to think long-term? Because remember, people are trading freedom for short-term security, but in the end, short-term security turns to long-term tyranny. You literally, those people are so far gone that you literally need to give them a whole history book and say, listen here, read up on the history that is the institution of the state, and just how dangerous the state can be when it's given leeway by people who are sitting in front of their TV screens at night singing Kumbaya about people being locked down and banned from making a living.
Mpiyakhe, something I mentioned earlier, and that I would like to get your perspective on, because we haven't chatted with you yet this month. Sort of since the lockdown started, the importance of dissuading this dichotomy between health and economic activity, because people think it seems to be one or the other. Just your take on that.
Well, what happened actually, Chris. Look, you will probably appreciate this, is that the government, was faced with what can be perceived as a real life trolley problem, where they decided to make the utilitarian calculation of, okay, we are going to kill people, or people are going to die whatever we do.
Right.
If we act this way, we through our actions are going to kill people. If we don't act, the virus is certainly going to kill people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I think there's scope to question the merits of that kind of approach. I mean, I think, like, how to in a liberal democracy like ours, how do you weigh one person's life against another person's life?
Yep.
I mean, how do you say that, if it saves 100 people, then we should kill Mpiyakhe?
Mm-hmm.
If let's say through my work I become very wealthy, for some, like, I become a billionaire, I have 1 billion rands. And then they say, okay, let's take Mpiyakhe's 1 billion rands from him, divide it among 100 people, and then just kill him. And then this is better for the greatest number of people. So clearly, it's the better option.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of thinking as well has to be guarded against, which is why we can't only rely on data-driven approaches. We also have to be questioning the principles and the motives and the premises that the government is relying on in making these decisions.
Yeah, it turns people into just, I guess, units that are exactly the same needs and wants and potential. Exactly. And whatever. There's no, again, even going back to high school and university, we talk so much about human dignity and agency, but it seems it's very quickly dissipating, where those things are just nice buzzwords to use, but we don't apply them or understand them in a very substantive, meaningful way.
Yeah, the implication is that you're not an end in yourself. You're just, a means of, serving some greater good for the collective, which is society or the state or whatever,
mm-hmm.
to make sure that, that collective survives, or as many of that, or as much of it survives, because it's just relying on raw numbers, which is wrong. I mean, those 8 people or roundabouts that have been killed through state action during the lockdown, they matter just as much as the 58 people who have died so far from COVID-19 as well. And so we really need to have some serious introspection around this as a society, I think.
Mm-hmm. Jacques, I've gone a bit on a tangent on a different thing. I was going to ask you the same question as I asked Mpiyakhe. If you were in the presidential position and you had to sort of do a smart lockdown, maybe your answer would be the same as Mpiyakhe's, but would there be any wrinkles or any differences to what you think a sort of smart lockdown or different policy approach could be? Maybe, there is no such thing as a smart lockdown. Any lockdown that takes away liberty, nothing can be smart about that.
Do you want the ideologically purist view or the pragmatic?
No, let's get both. I mean, I would like to know what you think of sort of both avenues.
No, I think a smart way to go about this would be a data-driven approach, and actually boosting the healthcare sector and healthcare interventions, because remember, starvation and famine is itself a healthcare issue.
Mm-hmm.
Lack of people not being allowed to make a living for themselves, that in and of itself constitutes a health issue. Starving and not making a living for themselves is not a viable alternative to contracting a virus. So what the viable alternative would be is, in fact, lifting the lockdown, allowing people to go back to work, and then basically going out there, introducing mass testing on a mass scale like South Korea did, and for instance, New Zealand did, etc. And if need be, handing out face masks and sanitizers to, for instance, those in the informal sector. But bottom line is, you cannot stop people from surviving. You cannot fight a virus by trying to stop people from earning a living. That's blatantly it. I mean, when people ask what's our alternative when we criticize the plans, our alternative is exactly that which we are criticizing. Stop banning people from earning a living. Stop forcing people to starve to death. Stop forcing people to rely on government handouts. Let people at least make a living for themselves, and engage in measures, constructive measures with civil society to rather boost knowledge and education about the virus and how you can prevent yourself from contracting, because no sane individual wants to contract the virus. So I think we all reasonably need to come together and consider the fact that forcing people to go without food is not the way to fight a global pandemic.
Mm-hmm. I think we've covered sort of the avenues I wanted to look at. We've been going for almost half an hour. Do you guys, I'll give you, Mpiyakhe, I'll give you, and then Jacques, I'll give you the final word. But Mpiyakhe, any sort of parting thoughts, anything you'd like to leave the viewers with?
I think the most important takeaway from this discussion today is that, you know, there's actually harmony between the ideological and the pragmatic, because, you know, if there is this harmony between real life and what is in your head, then what is in your head needs to change, because like you have to live in the real world, like you have to interact with existence as it is. And so there has to be harmony between both approaches. And I think you can show it. For example, if you think about it, what the fundamental question, that one of the questions that we are faced with during this time is, what is the best way to account for information around uncertainty of variables that you can measure in nature? In nature, such as the, like, you know, things like the RO factor, which measures the reproducibility of the virus and things like that. That can be considered as a natural variable. So what's the best way to account for that? A mathematical model produced by an institution, university, that is very selective about who it lets in, or the free market of individuals interacting with each other and gaining information and acting on that information in their immediate domain, which on the aggregate tends to produce the better results in other domains. So I think there's a route there to show that actually there's harmony there. And I don't think like the heavy-handed approach can be discredited rationally. Yeah.
Thanks. Jacques, anything for you?
To summarize the alternative approach, there's no perfect plan here. It will always be a case of choosing the lesser evil. The lesser evil is preventing as many people from dying as possible. You will not achieve that if in a country such as South Africa, with extensive poverty levels and extensive malnutrition levels in general without a pandemic, if you implement a extensive lockdown as you did now, you will actually cause more death and destruction than you will in the alternative. So the alternative is actually raising the lockdown to prevent more people from dying. It's counterintuitive, but that's what people need to consider, because in a lockdown, if people cannot make a living, more people will eventually die than from the virus alone. And consider the fact that we still aren't sure about exactly what the mortality rate of this virus is.
I think that's a good summation. Viewers, thank you once again for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope we gave you quite a bit to think about, to chew over and digest. I wish you all health and safety for the coming weeks, for as long as any version of the lockdown is in force. Let's see how best we can navigate these things. Please, just a reminder to visit our website, www.freemarketfoundation.com. There you can find all of our articles, our media releases, our reports, the research we've been doing on the coronavirus lockdown. Please remember to like this video. Please share it. And please also subscribe to our channel. Thank you to those of you who have been watching our videos in the last few weeks. We've noticed a great uptick in the amount of viewers, so we really appreciate that. We thank you for your time. Have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you guys again next week. But for now, bye.